Is China's closest ally about to see a regime change? The US released an intel report on the origins of COVID. And China passes an anti-hegemony law. That and more on this week's China News Headlines. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Xi Jinping's best bro might be in big trouble. I'm not sure anyone saw this coming. One of Russia's mercenary groups, the Wagner group, turned on Russian leadership this weekend in a surprise attack. Russian President Vladimir Putin vowed to crush the armed insurrection, but then backtracked and granted it immunity in exchange for leaving the country. Yevgeny Prigozhin agreed to go to Belarus in exchange for amnesty, but the stunt he pulled drew back the curtain on Russia's weakness. Prigozhin's Wagner group got within 150 miles of the capital and took the city of Rostov-on-Don along the way. Putin claimed that Russians were behind him all the way, but this was the kind of hero's welcome that Wagner fighters got from Putin's supposedly loyal followers. A lot of people saw this as a big challenge to Putin, and to many it raised questions about Putin's hold on power. That's an especially important question for China, which is arguably Russia's closest ally. The Chinese government was silent about the mutiny until after it ended on Saturday. On Sunday, the Chinese Foreign Ministry released a statement. It said only that the rebellion was Russia's internal affair and that China supports Russia in maintaining its national stability. Some speculate that China's muted reaction belies anxiety over the war and the global balance of power. As I said, Russia is one of China's closest allies, and the leaders are a key aspect to that relationship. Xi Jinping and Putin have several times now said they have a no-limits friendship. However, that no-limits friendship might actually have some limits. In recent months, government advisors have expressed increasing frustration with Russia behind closed doors, feeling Beijing is increasingly being dragged around by Moscow's risk-taking behavior. According to the Associated Press, Chinese foreign policy experts are also worried about how Russia's war has revived NATO. Japan has even requested a NATO liaison office to be set up in Tokyo to counter the threat from China, which is something that has never happened before. Some Chinese foreign policy experts fret that the war could prompt a renewal of American alliances in East Asia. And speaking of allies, whatever China says about its neutrality in the Ukraine war, it's clearly backing Russia. The New York Times reports that a state-run Chinese company sent large shipments of gunpowder to a Russian munitions factory last year. Poly Technologies described the powder as being for assembly of foreign-style hunting cartridges. Oh, right, like those hunting cartridges they used to hunt Ukrainians. Gotcha. The New York Times says the delivery was enough to fuel 80 million rounds of ammunition, and it quoted a defense expert as saying this was definitely for military use. Now, in February, the U.S. said China was considering providing lethal aid to Russia, but so far it says that hasn't happened. But it has said it's worried about private Chinese companies doing so, which in China is kind of a distinction without a difference. Chinese companies, even if they're privately owned, are all under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. If the party wants Chinese companies to do something, they'll do it. And speaking of the war in Ukraine, there's more than one perspective on that in the U.S. media, which is why I used ground news to see how it's being covered on the political left versus the center versus the right. As you can see, some stories get almost entirely right-leaning coverage, and others get mostly left-leaning coverage. On the app and website, the homepage is the same for everyone, helping break through echo chambers and media bubbles caused by clickbait headlines and manipulative algorithms. Even better, there's a feed called Blind Spot, which lets you see stories that are being over or underreported by only one side of the spectrum. Like if you search for China politics, you can see that some topics are basically only covered by the left or right, which is why without ground news, it's easy to miss key stories. Ground News is on a mission to hold the media accountable and provide context so we can easily see how media narrative can shape public opinion. It's a great place to go if you want to be more informed than the average news reader and find multiple international perspectives that you might otherwise have missed. And it's also just really interesting to see all the hidden biases in the media. And that's why we're working with Ground News to sponsor this video. Sign up at ground.news/China Uncensored or subscribe through my link before July 5th and get it for 30% off, as little as $5 a month. And after the break, did we just learn the origins of COVID? Welcome back. Last week we were supposed to learn everything the U.S. intelligence community knows about the origins of COVID. But today we know only what the White House wants us to know. President Joe Biden signed a bill in March that requires the U.S. government to declassify intel on the origins of COVID. That bill gave the government 90 days to do so. And as we reported before, the deadline to that ended on one of the days Secretary of State Antony Blinken was in Beijing. The Biden administration delayed releasing those documents until 5 days after the deadline. And then what it did release was a mere 10-page summary, 3 pages of which were the appendix. It's like being offered ice cream only to watch it fall on the floor. Not only was the summary absurdly brief, but it didn't actually do what the law said, which was to declassify the intelligence. The report basically says the government is divided on the origins of COVID. It says the National Intelligence Council and 4 other intelligence community agencies believe in the natural origin theory. That means they believe COVID was passed to humans through animals and not as a result of a lab leak. However, both the Department of Energy and the FBI both believe COVID did come from a lab, although for different reasons. And the CIA and another agency the report didn't identify remained undecided. It said all agencies believe that COVID was not a bioweapon intentionally released by the Chinese military, but it did cite connections between the military and the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which was the main culprit in the lab leak theory. It said they collaborated on research, including on coronaviruses, but no known viruses that could plausibly be a progenitor of SARS-CoV-2. No known viruses. Unknown viruses that, for example, weren't reported to the world by the Wuhan Institute of Virology could be a different matter, potentially. The summary also said they had collaborated on vaccines for coronaviruses before the pandemic began, which is just one of the many suspicious things this report cites that it says doesn't rise to the level of a smoking gun. Another example, in 2013, the Wuhan Institute of Virology collected a bat coronavirus that was 96.2% similar to COVID-19. However, it says that wasn't a close enough match to be what caused the pandemic. It said the lab had poor safety precautions and aging infrastructure, which could contribute to an accident, but again, that wasn't proof positive COVID escaped from the lab. The same thing with researchers falling ill shortly before COVID was known to start spreading in Wuhan. It could be evidence, or it could be a coincidence. One thing I found troubling about the report, though, they seem to be taking China's word about those workers' diagnoses. It says China's National Security Commission investigated the Wuhan Institute of Virology in early 2020 and took blood samples from its researchers. According to the World Health Organization's March 2021 public report, Wuhan Institute of Virology officials stated lab employee samples all tested negative for SARS-CoV-2 antibodies. Did they not watch China lie all through the pandemic and the WHO totally whitewash it? What's the point of having intel agencies if they just take China's word? This is like if the US government released a report saying there were no casualties from the Tiananmen Square massacre because China said there weren't. Now, there was a classified part to this report that wasn't released to the public, and according to the chair of the House Intel Committee, that classified intelligence paints a very different picture than this summary.
In the report that was given to the president, the 90-day or so report, they have information in that report that contradicts, I believe, the impressions that are given in these statements by the Intelligence Committee.
He and other Republicans are now preparing for a face-off with the Biden administration over declassifying the intel, which is what the law was supposed to do. And after the break, Is China going to topple Western hegemony? Welcome back. China has passed a foreign relations law targeting Western hegemony. The law gives China the right to take countermeasures if the West puts on sanctions. Not that China didn't have the ability to sanction people and entities before. In April, it put Raytheon and Lockheed Martin on its entity list, which, let's be honest, was really symbolic because the U.S. defense companies don't do business with China. According to Bloomberg, the umbrella legislation gives Beijing's existing toolkit more weight by embracing it in a legal document alongside two of Xi's signature foreign policy initiatives. Sanctions is one of the weapons that China is preparing for as it's going to war over Taiwan. China is no doubt watching all the sanctions the West has put on Russia, and it knows that if it makes a similar move on Taiwan, sanctions like those will also be placed on China. And French President Emmanuel Macron says no global agenda can be accomplished without the U.S. and China fully behind it.
For the critical elements where you will increase divisions and conflictuality and tensions between the US and China, we should try to moderate them, to find a way to, discuss quietly and build the relevant fora to decrease tensions.
He gave the Paris Climate Agreement as an example of an international issue that can be tackled with the US and China working together. It's true that both the US and China signed the agreement, but I'm not sure I would hail that as some sort of coup for the international agenda. The deal doesn't have any teeth, and China, which emits more greenhouse gases than all the developed countries combined, only put out a plan in 2021 to hit a carbon emissions peak before 2030. Meanwhile, China has been building up its coal plant capacity week by week. So if and when it does peak its CO2 emissions, it's not necessarily going to stave off climate change. Macron took heat from world leaders a few months ago for saying France shouldn't blindly follow the U.S. into a war with China over Taiwan. A poll earlier this month said 62% of Europeans would want to stay neutral in the event of a war over Taiwan. That poll also found 43% of Europeans view China as a necessary partner they want to cooperate with. Not that polls are necessarily a reliable indicator of where the public's at on an issue. But as I mentioned, this episode is sponsored by Ground News, and it's a great tool to help you stay well informed about what's happening in the world and how it's being covered by all sides of the political spectrum. Check it out at ground.news/China Uncensored or click the link below. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.